The other thing that happened to Headwaters that we didn't expect, that none of us expected, is COVID-19 happened. And I think as a health foundation, we knew that we needed to step up and have a response to what we were seeing happening in Western Montana as a result of COVID-19. So we went to our board and we said, we know that we have all these programs and all these things that we've done, but this is a time when organizations like Headwaters need to step up. And so we asked the board to grant an additional $500,000 this year to address the needs that we were hearing from our grantee partners on the ground. And what we heard from them is that there were two major issues that they were seeing. One is the need for childcare, especially for frontline workers. The need that was being created by the economic situation of closing down the state in the early part of the pandemic, and the food security issues that were raised as people lost their jobs and their income and their ability to provide food. So those $500,000 that were approved, we spread out across Western Montana. And the way we did it was we started picking up the phone to all our grantees, saying what was needed and who needed to be funding. And we ended up making about 70 grants with that $500,000. The vast majority of it went to help support food banks and food pantries to address food security, but also a lot of resources into the childcare idea. So a lot of grants to programs like the YMCA here in Missoula that started to create programs for childcare for frontline workers. And then on the Flathead, there was the birth of this new organization called the Flathead Res Community Action Group. And what they did is they came together as a community, a series of individuals that live on the Flathead Reservation that recognize that many of the elders that were going to be in lockdown did not have the ability to get resources or to have ways to travel safely or secure the things that they would need in order to be at home sheltering and in order to stay healthy. So they put together a group that went online on Facebook. You can actually join them if you're interested in watching them. And they put out a call for anybody who needed help. And they have this picture that's on here. They have been providing food for all of the seniors that are homebound. They have been providing rides. They have been coordinating other nonprofits in the region to address the variety of needs that are addressed. So it's been really fun and interesting to see how local communities have responded to this pandemic, and an honor for us to be able to support those programs. The other bucket of grant making that we have are these policy and influence grants. And the idea here is that, again, we believe that Headwaters can play a role in informing the development of good policy in Montana around social determinants of health. A couple of examples of the things that we've supported so far are listed here. One is we partnered with the Montana Healthcare Foundation to fund the development, or to fund a report on the economic impact of the Medicaid expansion in Montana. And this was important in the conversation that the legislature was having around whether or not to extend the Medicaid expansion here in Montana. And it was a nonpartisan, just look at the facts of what economic impact had happened, and became a very useful piece of information as policymakers were determining whether or not to continue the Medicaid expansion in the state. Another example of these grants is an effort that we have funded here in Missoula called Common Good Missoula. They also are on Facebook if you're interested in looking into them. And they've been working over the last year to build a large and diverse network of everyday people across social and political divides to address social determinants of health. And they started organizing in person, but through COVID, obviously have been doing it via Zoom, and have tackled a number of issues here in Missoula that have informed policies related to housing primarily, a little bit of COVID, and most recently engaging in conversations around how the city wants to think about the social justice, racial inequity issues that have come into the state as a result of what's happening at the national level. And then the capacity building piece, I think, is really important for me to talk about, because I think it's not something that folks understand either what capacity building is or that foundations can do it. So the first piece of our capacity building piece is thought partnership to the nonprofits that we support. So there are many organizations across Western Montana that now don't hesitate to pick up the phone and call me or my staff to work through problems and challenges that they're facing, to identify new and innovative ways to do the work. And it feels like we are side by side with them as we work through these challenges, organization by organization. We also have been providing a lot of trainings, and the items that are listed here are probably the ones that we most commonly get requests for. So nonprofits say to us, we need help with financing, we need help with marketing our organization, fundraising, with board governance related issues, with strategic planning and leadership development. And the way that we provide this capacity building support, some of it is done by our staff. So I have actually facilitated lots of strategic planning retreats for nonprofits in Montana. I often lend out my CFO to organizations that are trying to figure out better ways to do their budgeting and financial planning. We have a communications staff person, and we've helped various nonprofits think about how to redo their marketing, or how to start doing marketing in some cases, as well as how they think about utilizing their web pages as platforms to advance their work. And then community gathering is another piece that I think is just on the early part of our work. Recently, we purchased the LaFleur building, which is the picture that you see here. This is where the loft is located on Main Street. And the idea behind purchasing this building is that it will become the future headquarters of the foundation on one floor. And the other floor, we are hoping to build out into community space that will have at least 2, maybe 3 conference rooms, some ability to turn them into 3 separate or make in one big conference room that will be available for nonprofits and other players in the community that are needing that kind of space. It will also have a small kitchen that will allow caterers to come in and utilize the space, so that if an organization wants to hold a fundraising event with food, they can do that. And we will also be offering programming out of this space to nonprofits and to the broader Missoula community. So again, just another different way for the resources of the foundations to be used by the community. So with that, I will stop sharing and I will open it up for any questions.
Sandy?
Oh, you answered my question. I just appreciate you coming and talking to us. My friend had rented space in that building that you bought, which is a good thing that you bought it for lots of reasons, but we were really unhappy that it was purchased, and you've helped me go a next step further. I also appreciate all that you're doing for us, and I didn't have an inkling to this process. So thank you so much for education.
Absolutely. And I know that losing the dance collective was sad, but I also do believe that we'll create a different kind of community space. And right now we are living in a building on Front Street. We pay a ridiculous amount of rent right now. The building's not owned by anyone locally, so the money doesn't stay here. And the argument I made to the board is, instead of paying almost $100,000 a year in rent, let's buy a building, let's create some value add back to the community, and then we keep it, all in Montana. And so that's sort of the way I've kind of thought about that being an additional resource in a different way than the dance collective and the loft, but obviously still a community space.
And one more question, and how did you arrive here in Missoula?
Well, I had been working at the Blue Cross Blue Shield Foundation in California, and I actually got a call from a headhunter who was looking to hire a CEO to run this foundation. And when he called me, my first reaction was like, I don't even know where Montana is. I'm not interested. No, thank you. And he just kept, calling me. And eventually one day he reached me, and I was in a leadership program at the time where I was trying to determine whether or not I wanted to stay in philanthropy, because philanthropy for me is broken, traditional philanthropy,
Oh.
and wanted to not do that anymore, and was trying to figure out what would be the next step. And through that leadership program, you got an opportunity to build out a vision for what you would do if you could do anything with the remainder of your career. And I reinvented philanthropy and created a new approach. And I had just presented that at my cohort when he called again, and he said, one of my candidates dropped out. Can you please do me the favor and just fill in? And I said, oh, I would love to, but I'm presenting this plan in Minneapolis the day before, so I can't do it. And so then he said to me, well, there's a direct flight from Minneapolis to Missoula. Can I, I'll fly you from Minneapolis and then I'll fly you back to California. And so I said, okay, well, what the heck, I'll do it. And it was in December, and it was awfully cold. It was like one of these below zero, like 10 below zero days in Missoula. The snow, it was clear, like beautiful, but the snow was all dark and mushy. And I remember landing and driving from the airport to the meeting and thinking, why would I want to live here? Like, this is so awful. I went to the interview and I thought, well, here I have this new vision for this different way for philanthropy to be. I don't really want to be here, so I'm just going to test drive this new model with this group of people that I have no clue. And I think it became this moment of like all the stars aligning and me being able to say, there's a new foundation. Here's what I would do. Here's what how it would be different. Here's how it would really be about community. And walked away thinking they're never going to hire me. And then I got the call. And then we had a long conversation with my husband and my two kids about whether or not we were going to leave California and come to Montana. And I can tell you that it's brought me a lot of joy and satisfaction to be able to be running a foundation that is very different. We often get calls from across the country to come and talk about the uniqueness and the innovation that we're doing at Headwaters. And I'm just I'm so gleeful when I think about this little tiny foundation relative to other foundations in the country is leading the charge on so many things. And we're being asked to speak in Philadelphia and West Virginia, in North Carolina, in California, which is I think is pretty awesome. And then just personally, really, I feel like I should have been born in Montana because everything about it has just fit me like a glove. And even my kids, I think, who were really nervous about coming, they were 11 and 13 when we moved here. Now often I tease them about, should we go back? And they're like, absolutely not. And so from both a personal and a professional perspective, this has been a wonderful community to join.
Good.
Yeah, Jim. San Francisco.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. So a couple of different things. And I've been in philanthropy and at a number of different foundations for such a long period of time that I feel like I can be critical because I was actually part of that myself and part of the problem. So here are some basic components that I shared with our board of how I think about philanthropy being broken. Number one, many foundations, the board sits there and reviews grant proposals and makes decisions about who gets funding. And often the people that are on these boards are people that don't have the lived experience of the issues that we're working on. Two, many of them have never worked in nonprofits, so don't understand the challenges of what it takes to run a nonprofit. And three, many of them do not have the content expertise on the issues that we're working on. And so the question I always had is like, why do these very well-educated, really smart, powerful people get to make these decisions? And there may be a philosophical discussion that we could have around that, about the pros and cons of that. But I think that creates challenges for communities about who's getting to decide for them, about who's getting money. So that's one thing. The second thing is On average, it takes organizations 40 hours to complete a proposal. And that's not even a guarantee of funding. So why, just ask yourself, why are we in philanthropy making people waste, from my perspective, 40 hours of time on chasing money that they may not even get when they have mission critical work to do on the ground? And it would be so much better if they took that time and spent it on the mission critical work of the organization. The other piece is that the amount of time that foundation staff in keeping the machine churning in order to do the due diligence, review proposals, make internal recommendations, write all this stuff up. It's a significant bureaucratic animal. And quite honestly, I think people that work in foundations get nervous about the way we're doing work because we've eliminated all of that. And what that means is that my staff don't actually sit around and read proposals and have conversations internally about what we're going to do or organize things for a board committee or the board to review and approve. No, they're actually on the ground working with community in the way that I described by being a resource to folks. And so there is greater, I think, value add of my team in the community than if I did a traditional approach. And there's greater job satisfaction because at many of the foundations that I've worked at where I've run the program department, everybody's unhappy because it feels like you're on this hamster wheel just processing paper and moving things from thing to thing, versus my staff who gets so satisfied from being on the ground in community, partnering and helping nonprofits. So I think those are, some of the key examples that I use to describe why I think philanthropy is broken. And the other thing I'll say is whenever there is money involved, there is power and there is ego. And so much of these resources are controlled in traditional philanthropy by a very small number of people. In reality, what has happened is that as these foundations and other kinds of foundations are created, that money that would have normally gone into the tax base to support a lot of different things that we as a society need government to provide for is not going into those buckets. And so it's now being controlled by a small group of people. And you just have to ask yourself, I think, is that who should control it? Or should community control it on the ground? Can there be a more democratic approach to philanthropy than what we currently have? No, actually, I think that there were a couple of things that made me change my mind. One, the board was really smart in selling Missoula and Montana, and so when I was debating whether or not I should take the job, they brought me back to Missoula, as well as my family, and we got an opportunity to connect with a variety of different organizations that do really neat things in Missoula, and an opportunity to meet with the board members and their family. And it became very evident very quickly how accessible and welcoming and kind people in Missoula are. So I think that overrode the snow and the cold and the dirty piles of snow and everywhere. I think the other thing was an opportunity to really demonstrate to the field of philanthropy that you can do it differently and you can still have impact. Because I think that there's a lot of sense in philanthropy that we have the answers. We're the ivory tower that has the resources and the information, and we know best. And I wanted to be able to show philanthropy that no, community knows best. People on the ground know best, and it can be just as powerful as the other models. And I think that gave me a real professional interest to overcome the cold and the snow. And now that I've been here, I had never skied in my life. And the first winter, I just stayed in my house. I was like, I'm scared of the snow. It looks beautiful from the window, and I'm going to stay in the house. But a colleague of mine who used to be a former ski instructor took me out and taught me how to ski. And I learned that I was a natural. This is why I said I should have been born in Montana, because I took to it in like a half hour. And I quickly went out and bought my own ski equipment. And I'm now an avid skier downhill, which, you know, I look younger than I am. I'm actually in my 50s. And I'm like, for a 50-year-old to like start downhill skiing for the very first time, it's kind of a little nerve-wracking and yet a lot of fun. So I think that I found a lot of things that I like about being here, the outdoors, the hiking, the winter activities. I've made the best of it.
Any other questions or comments? Richard?
Yep.
Richard?
Yeah, unmute. Thank you very much. That was a wonderful story, and you've done some wonderful things here. Here's a comment. My son teaches and coaches at Frenchtown High, and every time he speaks of the aquaponics, he has a big smile on his face. It's an important feature of the school system, and they really appreciate doing it. The other question I have is, what was Community Hospital doing with this $100 million before? Were they investing it and using it to reduce costs, or what were they doing with it?
So Community Hospital actually didn't have the money while it was operating as a non-for-profit. All the money that was generating, it was being put back into running the hospital. So they didn't actually have $100 million sitting in the bank. In fact, I think they were losing money, and I think that was probably one of the reasons why they felt like it would be better to sell it than to keep running it and potentially end up in a situation where you're so in the red that you have to close down the hospital. So the $100 million came from the sale. And quite honestly, I think the board, when they were thinking about selling it, were thinking that they were going to get 30, 40, maybe $50 million. And were really surprised when it ended up being $100 million. And I think it ended up being that high because you can make a lot of money in healthcare if you actually run it in certain ways, not necessarily always great ways, but in certain ways. And so it had the potential to generate a lot of money. And so that's where the $100 million came. So they didn't actually have it. It got generated from the sale.
Lee?
You were talking about the relationship between foundations and the government doing things for the people through a tax base. And that reminded me of an article I read a few years ago about some very wealthy person through his foundation was helping refurbish the Washington Monument. And the writer was saying, have we come to this point in our country where the government doesn't refurbish the Washington Monument, but a wealthy person? So my question is, can you talk about the ratio between all the money that foundations have in this country versus the loss of tax revenue and what that could have provided for people through, like you said, a democratically appointed system of people? It seems like there's a lot of foundations with a lot of money.
There are.
As you said, they're controlled by just a very few people who don't live the life like ordinary people do in Missoula. They're not people who work at McDonald's who are running these foundations.
Yeah, so I can't speak about specific numbers right now off the top of my head. I'd have to kind of come back to you, and I'm happy to do that, of what we're talking about in terms of actual dollars. But I can tell you that it's in the billions. And it's not only foundations. There are also new philanthropic structures that have been created in this country that are even pulling more money out of the tax base. So there are these things called donor advised funds. And a lot of wealthy individuals, especially in the tech industry right now, are putting a lot of money into donor advised funds. And that money allows them to get a significant tax break, and it can sit at a foundation, at a community foundation, or in some other entity that is holding it for them forever without any requirement of distribution. And So there's a number of other kinds of structures that exist. And so when you really look at how much money is being held and the power that is held by the people that control that, it's pretty significant. I have an article that I'll email to you guys about this issue that came out in the Chronicle of Philanthropy that talks about this. And I think that there's a congressional push right now to revisit those structures. And obviously, if it's a Biden administration, more likely to pass, a Trump administration, less likely to pass. But the push is, can we get these donor advice funds to have some minimum distribution requirement? Can we increase the requirement on foundations above the 5%? Because so much of this money is being held and not being necessarily deployed and released out to meet the variety of needs that exist for those people that work at McDonald's and their families.
Are there any other thoughts or comments?
Say, Brenda? Hi. This is kind of off the subject now, but how's your Spanish? ¿Tú hablas español un poquito?
Oh, lo hablo muy bien.
Okay, bueno, la cosa is, every week we have a group of people who meet here in Missoula who speak Spanish. And they get together for an hour. In fact, it's this afternoon at 1 o'clock till 2 o'clock to keep our language up. And we have people from a lot of different backgrounds. And I'd like to give you the information on this group. Can I connect with you after this? Do you have a phone number or an email I could use?
Yeah.
Or?
I'll give you her email, Jim.
Okay.
That would be great.
I'll pass it on to you. Thank you. I'd like to see you join us.
Okay, no more promotion now.
Sorry.
Any other questions or comments? If not, Brenda, thank you very much. That was very informative, very interesting to hear what the foundation's doing and how it's developed. And good luck as it continues to grow.